Hey English 10, it's Molloy back again to fill you in on some things about Chapter 2 that might need some clarification. Starting off with the Valley of the Ashes. The chapter starts off with this long description of this area between New York and West Egg called the Valley of the Ashes. And what this actually was a dump. It was called the Corona Dump, of all things, and it was a place where nobody lived, obviously. And the reason it's covered with ashes is because a lot of people in the 1920s and before heated their homes with wood or coal and did their cooking with heat generated by wood or coal. And so the ashes had to go somewhere. And so you had a trash can and you also had an ash can. And the garbage men and the ash men would come and pick these things up from in front of your house and take them to the dump. But you can imagine millions of people, all burning wood, all burning coal. It's a tremendous amount of ash that has to go somewhere. And the other thing that you find in the Valley of the Ashes is the Eyes of T.J. Eckelberg. And over the years I have found that this has been really confusing to some students, so I'll just spill the beans here. The Eyes of T.J. Eckelberg are a billboard for an optician, or maybe an optometrist named T.J. Eckelberg, who must have had a practice in Queens. Queens is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. And so this billboard has been forgotten, presumably. Maybe T.J. Eckelberg is still in practice, maybe he's not, but this billboard seems to have been neglected and forgotten, so it is fading, but we still see the spectacles and the eyes looking out through the spectacles. And if you've done some secondary source reading, which I'd really rather you didn't do, you'll find that there are interpretations of this as being the eyes of God, looking out over the vast wasteland. That's half right. And when we get to chapter 8, I'll talk more about the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg and the symbolism of, that maybe this is supposed to be some form of God and what he is and what he isn't seeing. By the way, if you're a tennis fan and you've ever watched the U.S. Open, the U.S. Open is played at the United States Tennis Center, which is in Flushing, which is a neighborhood of Queens, and it is actually exactly where the Valley of the Ashes, the Corona Dump, used to be. So if you're ever in that part of the world, or if you ever go to the U.S. Open, you are exactly where F. Scott Fitzgerald envisions the Valley of the Ashes. So, a couple of you had questions about Tom's apparent openness about his mistress, Myrtle. Yeah, Tom seems to think that his position in the world is just so secure that he doesn't even have to worry about people finding out that he has a mistress. If people gossip about it, he doesn't really care. This is sort of his extreme confidence and personal security about his position in the world. He's a very wealthy man. He's kind of a powerful guy. He can do whatever he wants, and so he will, and nobody can really say anything about it. Somebody commented on the irresponsibility of buying a puppy from a street vendor. I think one of the things that Fitzgerald is pointing out about people like Tom, people like Myrtle, to a lesser extent people like Daisy, is that they seem to move through life as if there are no consequences at all for anything they do. And this gets more into this, what I was talking about last time, in the decade of the 1920s, people really wondering what morality is and where it comes from. And do we really need to worry about following rules, the rules that have sort of governed society for the last 2,000 to 5,000 years. There was some confusion also about the nature of the party that Myrtle and Tom start in their little, love nest apartment in Manhattan. The people at the party are Myrtle's friends, not Tom's. And yes, Myrtle is kind of putting on a show for everybody, But it's more like she's showing her middle-class friends how important she is becoming because she is the mistress of this very, very wealthy man, Tom Buchanan. But this is not an upper-class party. This is not Tom's world, and Myrtle is trying to circulate in it. This is actually Myrtle's world, and Tom's kind of putting up with it. There were a couple of comments about how everybody seems to know something about Gatsby, but they also seem to know nothing about Gatsby. It's all rumors. It's all conjecture about who he is and where he came from. Everybody seems to know about him, that he's there, but nobody really seems to know where he comes from. So yes, Fitzgerald is trying to build our curiosity about Gatsby by building Nick's curiosity. And he's putting us in the same position that Nick is in, which is we keep hearing about this guy, but we don't really know anything at all about him, at least not yet. Another little point of confusion for a couple of you. It was actually Myrtle's sister, Catherine, who was asking why Tom and Daisy don't get divorced. She's the one who seems to think that Tom should get rid of Daisy and marry Myrtle because they are much more interested in each other than Tom is in his wife. But that might not actually be correct. And this is where we come to the thing about Catherine says to Nick that the reason that Tom and Daisy don't get divorced is because Daisy is Catholic and Catholics cannot get divorced. And Nick makes the remark to us that Daisy's not Catholic, and he's surprised at the elaborateness of the lie. So there was some question about this and why this is happening. So here's the deal. Tom, the only way that Catherine, Myrtle's sister, would be under the impression that Daisy is Catholic is if Tom told Myrtle that Daisy is Catholic. So what I imagine is that Myrtle presses Tom to get divorced and marry her, and Tom doesn't want to. Tom likes being married to Daisy. He has no intention of leaving her. He is just having fun with Myrtle on the side. And so to end that conversation, Tom says, Daisy's Catholic, she'll never give me a divorce, it's not even worth talking about. So I think that's what's going on there. It was a way for Tom to put the subject away and stop facing pressure from Myrtle to marry her. The question of the fight, and when the fight comes about, that there's an argument about whether Myrtle has any right to say Daisy's name. So I think what you need to envision is a very childish kind of conversation and argument where Myrtle's complaining about Daisy and that Tom won't leave her, and Tom says that Myrtle has no right to say Daisy's name. And then what we see in the dialogue is that Myrtle says, I'll say it anytime I want to, Daisy, 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 and then Tom smacks her in the head. Somebody noted that he breaks her nose with his open hand, and that this was a suggestion of just how strong and powerful a man physically Tom is. And I think that's partially true. Hang on just a second. So it's partially about how big and strong Tom is physically. Absolutely. That is part of the equation. But it's even more complicated than that, I think, because so the distinction is made between striking her with his open hand versus balling up his fist, I think, and punching her the way he might punch a man if he were in a fist fight. And so it seems like he's got some kind of self-control, that almost as if he were going to strike her to make a point but not to injure her, but he also doesn't know his own strength. And so he does end up breaking her nose in the process. I don't think we're supposed to think better of him for not balling up his fist and punching her. So that's why I say it's quite complicated. He makes a choice there not to do that, and yet even sort of the idea is that he's almost really just that he has slapped her, which is incredibly bad, but that he was not trying to injure her as much as he knows he could, but she still ends up with the broken and bloody nose. Somebody was curious about why Nick wipes the shaving lather from Mr. McKee's face. And I don't think it's a huge deal, but it is sort of an intimate gesture that he makes. He does mention the lather on Mr. McKee's face as soon as he comes in, that he must have been shaving and just missed a spot. And it's sort of been bugging him all evening, and he finally takes out his handkerchief while McKee is asleep and removes this lather that had been troubling him all afternoon. But the end of the chapter, some of you noticed, gets really confusing and strange with Mr. McKee, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Somebody was under the impression that everyone left after Myrtle got her nose broken, and it's actually only Nick and Mr. McKee who leave. Everybody else, including Tom, stays behind as far as we know. We don't know when they left, but they do stay to take care of Myrtle. It's not like, Myrtle gets hurt and everybody runs out on her. I didn't want you to be under that impression, but Nick is done with the party and Mr. McKee is done with the party, and so they leave. Also, Nick does not leave as soon as he can to get back on a train to West Egg. It seems that he spends most of the night in the train station. Because the end of the chapter is what we call elliptical. What I think Fitzgerald is going for here is something we call expressive form, which is where what the narrative does is the same as what the narrative says. And so this is kind of an interesting moment. Nick tells us that he's only been drunk twice in his life, and this occasion is the second time. And so what you find, if you go back through this chapter, if you do a quick flip through, if you reread a little bit, especially the last third of the chapter, what you find is that the narrative becomes more and more fragmented as Nick gets more and more drunk. So his memories of the end of the party are much less clear than his memories of the beginning and of his trip on the train into the city with Tom and Myrtle. So he's losing bits of time. He says he looked at his watch and it was 9 o'clock. He looked at it again and it was 10. An hour sort of disappears on him. And then his narrative of the fight and Myrtle getting punched and the blood and the screaming, it's all very sort of fragmented. And then we get to the most fragmented part of the chapter, which is the very end, where he's headed down in the elevator with Mr. McKee, and then it's sort of like, dot, dot, dot. The next thing I know, I'm in Mr. McKee's apartment. He's sitting up in his bed. He's in his underwear, and they're looking at the photographs in Mr. McKee's album. And then the next thing he knows, he wakes up in Penn Station, which was a big, actually still is a great big train station in New York City, though it's not in exactly the same place it was in 1922. And he's waiting for the 4 o'clock train, presumably to go home. So all of that is very confusing. And we can only say that Fitzgerald has intentionally left a lot of blank spaces here, especially at the end of the chapter. Some critics have suggested that Nick is either gay or bisexual, and that he has had some kind of an encounter with Mr. McKee, who was also described as sort of feminine and of an artistic type. So those are stereotypes, but they're stereotypes that Fitzgerald's readers might have agreed with. And so, there's no right or wrong there. There's no yes or no there. Fitzgerald has not spelled it out for us. But there might be some other suggestions along the way, very subtle suggestions. that maybe some of Nick's interest in Gatsby is romantic on some level. He certainly admires him. He certainly recognizes how handsome he is. Nick does date Jordan Baker, but he doesn't do that enthusiastically. So again, it's out there. It's a subject that is a topic of conversation among critics and people who are interested in this text and in Fitzgerald scholarship. But there is no answer to that question. It's an intriguing possibility and opens things up for different kinds of interpretations and conversations about the novel. So that is just about everything, I think, that I wanted to tell you about Chapter 2. If you have any other questions or are looking for other clarifications about what you read, of course, you can email me anytime. And please watch for my video response to your Chapter 3 comments. Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot. See ya.